The night was already alive with activity in the emergency department. The fluorescent lights hummed over the steady rhythm of footsteps, the low murmur of voices, and the occasional shriek of a monitor. Dr. Elijah Parker moved through the hallways with a practiced calm, his mind already on his patients. Each one a case he took on with the meticulous care his reputation was built on. His coat felt heavy on his shoulders tonight, perhaps weighed down by the events of the day, or maybe just by the unspoken burdens he had carried for so long. As he prepared to start his shift, Elijah couldn't shake the feeling of responsibility that wrapped around him like a second skin. Medicine, for him, was more than a career. It was a calling, something he had pursued relentlessly since childhood. Raised in a close-knit family that had instilled in him the value of compassion and resilience, he knew he carried the hopes of his parents, who had sacrificed to see him through school. It was a story he seldom told, but it was one that lingered in his mind with every patient he cared for. In his quiet moments, he thought of his mother, who had worked double shifts to support him, and his father, who had always encouraged him to dream beyond the limitations the world tried to impose on him. As the night wore on, Elijah found himself pulled into a succession of cases: an elderly woman with a fractured hip, a young boy with a severe asthma attack, and a man who had suffered a minor stroke. Each one presented its own challenges, and each one was handled with the same quiet intensity that marked his approach to medicine. To those who observed him, Elijah's presence was steady, almost serene, but underneath, he carried the weight of past rejections, instances where patients or even colleagues had questioned his abilities simply because of his race. But tonight, something in the air felt different. He brushed off the feeling, focusing instead on the case at hand. Then, a call came through from the paramedics. "Dr. Parker, we have a critical inbound. 56-year-old female, suspected cardiac arrest at home. She's been revived en route, but her vitals are unstable." Elijah felt the adrenaline surge, sharpening his senses. He moved with purpose, organizing the necessary team and preparing for what he anticipated would be a challenging case. When the gurney came barreling through the ER doors, his focus narrowed on the unconscious woman. Her face was pale, her breathing shallow, but he saw signs of life: a weak pulse, a barely perceptible rise and fall of her chest. She was a stranger to him, yet in that moment she became his responsibility, a life he was determined to save. As he stepped into the OR, the world around him faded. There was only his team, the woman on the table, and the instruments he had come to trust as extensions of his own hands. His focus intensified, every movement calculated, precise. His mind worked through 1,000 possibilities, analyzing each detail with the sharp acuity he had honed over years of training. Hours passed, marked only by the sound of his breathing under his mask, the quiet hum of the machines, and the rapid, clipped instructions he issued to his team. He felt the weight of every choice he made, aware that any misstep could cost this woman her life. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he made the final suture, stepping back to assess his work. The woman's vitals had stabilized, and a sense of relief settled over him. The moment he stepped out of the OR, Elijah removed his gloves, took a long breath, and leaned against the wall. He knew he had done everything he could, yet there was no pride in it, just a deep sense of responsibility. For him, medicine was a discipline of humility, one that required him to check his ego at the door and focus entirely on the patient. As he made his way to the recovery room to check on her, a fleeting sense of satisfaction washed over him, quickly tempered by a cautious reserve. He had learned not to expect gratitude, especially from certain patients who saw him as an anomaly in his profession. When he entered the recovery room, he saw the woman, Bethany Wallace, stirring. Her face was still pale, eyes fluttering as she came to consciousness. Elijah felt a pang of relief, but it was quickly eclipsed by her reaction. Her eyes opened fully, and as she looked up at him, confusion morphed into something darker. There was no mistaking the look in her eyes, a mix of disdain and disbelief. "You." Her voice, though faint, carried a sharp edge. Her gaze moved over him, her lips curling in something close to a sneer. "I want to speak to the real doctor, not you." The words cut like a blade, but Elijah's expression remained calm. Years of dealing with subtle and overt biases had taught him the art of restraint. His face remained impassive as he met her gaze. "I performed your surgery, Miss Wallace," he replied, his voice measured. "You were in critical condition, but you made it through. I'll be overseeing your recovery from here on out." But Bethany's anger only deepened. "I don't want you touching me," she spat, her voice gathering strength. "I want someone who actually knows what they're doing." Elijah's grip on his clipboard tightened, but he remained outwardly calm. "You're receiving the best care available, Miss Wallace," he said, his voice as steady as he could manage. "If you would like a second opinion, I can arrange it." Without waiting for her response, he turned and left the room. Once outside, he allowed himself a moment to exhale, to release the frustration that simmered beneath his professionalism. In the privacy of the empty hallway, he leaned against the wall, his mind heavy with the familiar weight of disappointment. He had saved her life. Yet to her, he was nothing more than an unwelcome presence. Back in the staff room, he found Nurse Harris, a colleague who had always shown him quiet solidarity. Her face softened when she saw him, and though she said nothing, he felt the comfort of her unspoken support. "She giving you trouble?" she asked softly, her eyes filled with understanding. Elijah forced a small, weary smile. "Let's just say it's not the gratitude I'd hoped for." Nurse Harris shook her head. "She doesn't know the luck she's had, having you as her surgeon. You did everything right, Elijah." "Right doesn't always matter to some people," he replied, his tone laced with quiet resignation. Nurse Harris reached out, giving his arm a reassuring squeeze. "But it matters to us, and it matters to the lives you save. Don't let her bring you down." Elijah nodded, the weight of her words grounding him. He had a responsibility to carry, a purpose to fulfill, and the strength to bear whatever challenges came his way. But as he prepared to continue his rounds, he couldn't help but wonder how many more times he would have to prove his worth, how many more battles he would have to fight to be seen as the doctor he was, rather than just the color of his skin. This first encounter with Bethany wasn't the last, he knew, but he was prepared to face it all, no matter how hard the road ahead might be. Bethany Wallace had never known a world that didn't bend to her will. Raised in an upper-middle-class family, her life had always been insulated, filled with unspoken assurances of privilege and security. She'd grown up in a bubble that protected her, a life marked by the belief that everything she needed or wanted could be attained if only she was assertive enough, and Bethany was nothing if not assertive. As she lay in the sterile recovery room, resentment bubbled beneath the fog of anesthesia. The first thought that had crossed her mind upon waking was that something had gone wrong. She could feel an uncomfortable ache in her abdomen, a reminder that her body had been invaded, her health teetering on the edge. She hated the vulnerability, the dependence. But most of all, she hated the face she'd seen standing over her as she awoke. A young black doctor with a calm, unreadable expression. How could she, a woman of her stature, be at the mercy of someone like him? The bitterness gnawed at her, mingling with the throbbing pain in her body. She pressed the call button for the nurse, her impatience growing with each passing second. When Nurse Harris finally appeared, Bethany glared at her. "Is there no one else here who can handle my care?" she demanded, her voice rough and accusatory. Nurse Harris, a woman who had faced her own share of biases, maintained her professionalism. "Dr. Parker is one of our best surgeons, Miss Wallace. He saved countless lives, and he's overseeing your recovery." Bethany's mouth twisted into a frown. I don't care if he's the best doctor in the country. I don't want him treating me. The nurse's expression softened, though her voice remained firm. Miss Wallace, I understand that this situation may be difficult for you, but Dr. Parker is dedicated to your well-being. He only wants to help. But Bethany wasn't interested in explanations or assurances. All she saw was the insult of it, the humiliation of being reduced to a patient under someone she considered beneath her. She turned away, her face flushed with anger. As the days passed, Bethany's mood darkened and her resentment grew. Dr. Parker made his rounds each morning, checking on her progress with the same calm professionalism. But every time he entered her room, she felt her blood boil. To her, each visit was a reminder of her own vulnerability, her reliance on someone she didn't trust or respect. She made her displeasure known with every opportunity. She pressed the call button multiple times a day, complaining about the slightest discomfort, demanding to see someone else, anyone else, who could oversee her care. But the hospital staff continued to reassure her that Dr. Parker was the best person for the job. One afternoon, Elijah entered her room for a routine checkup. Clipboard in hand, his face neutral as always. He was prepared for the onslaught, her accusations, her glares, her thinly veiled insults. But he reminded himself of his commitment to his profession, his oath to do no harm, even to those who saw him as the enemy. Good afternoon, Miss Wallace, he began, his voice steady. I'm here to check on your recovery and see if we need to make any adjustments to your medication. Bethany's eyes narrowed. I don't need you to do anything for me, she snapped, crossing her arms defensively. I'm sure someone else can handle it. Elijah looked down at her chart, unperturbed. I understand that this may be uncomfortable for you, but I am your assigned doctor. My priority is your health, Miss Wallace, she scoffed, her face twisted in contempt. Priority? My health? You're probably looking for some way to make a mistake, to mess this up so that I pay the price. Elijah paused, his expression unreadable, though inside, her words stung. He had worked his entire life to prove himself, to be the best in his field, to rise above the low expectations people like her often placed on him. Yet, here he was, facing the same prejudice that had haunted him his entire career. I assure you, Miss Wallace, I have no intention of compromising your health in any way, he replied quietly, controlling the tension that threatened to surface in his voice. I took an oath to care for my patients, regardless of their personal feelings. Bethany rolled her eyes, dismissing his words as if they were empty promises. Oath or not, I don't trust you. I've seen enough of your kind to know what to expect. He felt a pang of anger, a rare, simmering resentment that he seldom allowed himself to feel. But he pushed it aside, choosing instead to remain composed. This wasn't the first time he'd faced these assumptions, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. He took a step back, his tone polite yet firm. If there's anything specific you need, Miss Wallace, please let the nursing staff know. I'll ensure that your requests are taken seriously. And with that, he left, his calm demeanor belying the frustration simmering beneath the surface. In the quiet solitude of his office that evening, Elijah allowed himself a rare moment of vulnerability. He sat at his desk, his hands clasped tightly together as he leaned forward, his mind replaying the day's encounters. Despite his best efforts, Bethany Wallace's words had struck a nerve. They reminded him of the many times he had been told he didn't belong. The moments where his competence was questioned, not because of any failure on his part, but because of his skin color. His phone buzzed on the desk, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from his mother, a simple note asking if he was doing well. He read her words, a small smile tugging at his lips despite the tension in his chest. His mother was his anchor, the person who had taught him resilience and strength. She had faced her own struggles in a world that often saw her as less, yet she had raised him to believe in his worth, to never let the world define him. Elijah took a deep breath, letting his mother's words ground him. He couldn't allow one patient, no matter how hostile, to shake his resolve. He had chosen this path for a reason, and he had made a promise to himself long ago, to be the kind of doctor he had once dreamed of becoming, one who saved lives without prejudice, without judgment. Yet the anger lingered, a quiet reminder that he was still human, still vulnerable to the wounds that words could inflict. Bethany lay in her bed that night, her thoughts swirling in a tangled web of resentment and frustration. But beneath the surface, a sliver of doubt crept in, a whisper she was unwilling to acknowledge. She hated feeling this way, hated the bitterness that gnawed at her. But something in Dr. Parker's steady gaze, in the quiet resolve with which he faced her, unsettled her. She had seen arrogance in doctors before, men who believed themselves untouchable. But Dr. Parker was different. He didn't retaliate, didn't raise his voice, didn't give her the satisfaction of a reaction. And that, perhaps, was what frustrated her most. It was as if he refused to play by her rules, to bend under the weight of her disdain. Instead, he stood his ground, resolute, a constant reminder that her assumptions could not break him. Yet, as she closed her eyes, a new feeling washed over her, something she didn't want to acknowledge. It was fear, a gnawing uncertainty that perhaps, just perhaps, she had been wrong. But pride held her captive, unwilling to concede, unwilling to face the possibility that she had judged him unfairly. And so the days continued, each encounter a battle of wills, each word exchanged laden with unspoken tension. Elijah remained steadfast, his professionalism unwavering, even as Bethany tried again and again to provoke him, to find a weakness in his calm exterior. But slowly, a shift began to take place, a subtle change in the air between them. And neither of them knew that this journey, this silent battle, would soon become something neither of them could have anticipated. The following morning, Bethany awoke to the usual hum of machines and the dull ache pulsing through her body. Each morning had followed the same rhythm since her surgery, an unrelenting discomfort, a familiar churning bitterness. She braced herself, knowing that Dr. Parker would soon appear with his neutral expression, his clipboard, his presence as steady and unyielding as always. And despite herself, a flicker of dread shadowed her mind. Yet this morning felt different. The silence of the room seemed heavier somehow, pressing down on her. In that silence, Bethany began to confront something she'd buried deep down, something that felt jagged and uninvited. A sense of responsibility. She had spent her life meticulously curating her reality, ensuring that everything from her family to her social circle affirmed her worldview. But here in this hospital room, stripped of her defenses, she could feel her anger unraveling, exposing a brittle vulnerability beneath. Bethany pushed the call button, her impatience thinly veiling the sense of unease that had crept into her. When Nurse Harris appeared, Bethany's tone softened almost imperceptibly. Could you let me know when Dr. Parker arrives?" Nurse Harris tilted her head, caught off guard by the slight shift in Bethany's demeanor. For days, Bethany had insisted on seeing anyone but Dr. Parker. Yet now, it seemed as though she was bracing herself for his presence rather than recoiling from it. "Of course, Miss Wallace," Nurse Harris replied, a note of compassion threading her words. "He should be here shortly." Bethany nodded, sinking back against the pillows, trying to calm the flutter of restlessness building within her. As the minutes ticked by, she caught herself rehearsing what she might say, the words tangled in her throat. She wasn't quite sure what she was preparing to admit, or if she was even capable of admitting anything. The remnants of her pride held firm, whispering that she had done nothing wrong, that her anger was justified. But a small, quiet part of her, long neglected and ignored, was beginning to ask questions she wasn't ready to answer. When Elijah entered her room, his gaze was calm but wary, as if bracing himself for the hostility that had marked each of their interactions. Bethany watched him, noting the subtle tension in his shoulders, the way he steeled himself before stepping closer. Her resentment simmered, but it was accompanied by a pang of guilt she couldn't quite shake. "Good morning, Miss Wallace." Elijah greeted her, his voice even, betraying nothing of the strain he'd felt over the past days. He glanced down at her chart, reviewing her vitals before meeting her gaze. "How are you feeling today?" Bethany hesitated, a strange impulse tugging at her, an urge to answer him honestly. Her throat tightened, the words caught between her resentment and her guilt. I still feel uncomfortable," she finally replied, her tone sharper than intended. She watched his reaction closely, hoping to catch a flicker of frustration or impatience, anything that would validate her anger. But his expression remained neutral, unyielding. "Discomfort is common in the recovery process," he said, his voice calm, "but I'll make adjustments to your medication to help ease it. If there's anything specific that's bothering you, feel free to let me know." Bethany's hands tightened around the bedsheet, a torrent of conflicting emotions bubbling beneath the surface. She was caught off guard by his professionalism, by the way he continued to offer her the same care and respect despite her treatment of him. The walls she had carefully constructed, walls that had shielded her from facing her own fears and biases, began to weaken. But her pride flared once more, a desperate attempt to regain control. "It's hard to feel confident in my recovery when I'm not even sure the person overseeing it can be trusted," she said, the words sharper than she intended. For a brief moment, she thought she saw a flicker of something, hurt, maybe, or frustration, in Elijah's eyes. But he recovered quickly, his voice steady as he replied, "I understand that trust is difficult, Miss Wallace, but my only concern is your well-being." Bethany's heart tightened, a sense of shame washing over her. She had expected him to retaliate, to meet her anger with anger, yet here he was, offering her understanding, offering her patience she didn't deserve. The realization gnawed at her, a quiet but relentless reminder of her own cruelty. And for the first time, she felt the weight of her actions pressing down on her, the undeniable truth that she had allowed her own prejudice to dictate her behavior. As the hours passed, Bethany's thoughts became a relentless storm, each one chipping away at the carefully constructed identity she had clung to for so long. Memories surfaced unbidden. Moments from her childhood, her family's whispered remarks, the subtle but persistent reinforcement of her own privilege. She had been taught, in ways both subtle and overt, that her value was inherent, that the world would always bend to her will. And she had carried that belief with her into every interaction, every encounter, certain that her place in the world was deserved. But here, in this hospital room, facing the quiet strength of a man she had tried to tear down, she began to question everything. She had built her life on a foundation of assumptions and judgments. Yet now, that foundation felt fragile, a brittle construct that could no longer support the weight of her own guilt. Later that day, Dr. Parker returned for his evening rounds. Bethany watched him as he reviewed her chart, noting the way he remained focused, his attention unwavering despite the hostility she had directed at him. She found herself studying his face, the quiet determination etched into his features, the resilience that seemed to radiate from him. And for the first time, she felt a sense of respect she couldn't deny, a grudging admiration for his ability to rise above her cruelty. When he met her gaze, she hesitated, the words she had prepared catching in her throat. She wanted to apologize, to acknowledge the wrong she had done, but the weight of her pride held her back. "Dr. Parker," she began, her voice faltering. She saw his eyes flicker with surprise, and a part of her hated the vulnerability she felt in that moment. "Yes, Miss Wallace," he replied, his tone cautious, as if bracing himself for another confrontation. She struggled for a moment, the words tangled in her mind. Finally, she managed to say, I wanted to thank you for your care." The surprise in his eyes was unmistakable, but he quickly masked it, his voice calm as he replied, "You're welcome, Miss Wallace. I'm here to ensure that you recover fully." Bethany nodded, feeling the shame creep up her spine. She had expected him to dismiss her words, to brush off her attempt at gratitude. But instead, he accepted it with the same calm professionalism he had shown from the beginning. And in that moment, she felt the weight of her own pettiness, the undeniable truth that she had allowed her own prejudice to taint her view of a man who had done nothing but offer her kindness. As Elijah left the room, Bethany lay back against the pillows, her mind a whirlwind of emotions she couldn't fully comprehend. She felt as though she were standing on the edge of a precipice, teetering between the person she had always been and the person she feared she might become. And for the first time, she allowed herself to consider the possibility that she could change, that she could confront the biases that had defined her life. But the journey ahead felt daunting, a path she wasn't sure she had the strength to walk. Yet as she lay in the quiet solitude of her hospital room, a single thought surfaced, a quiet but persistent whisper that refused to be silenced. She had been wrong. And the truth of that realization was both terrifying and liberating. Bethany spent the next few days in a state of restless contemplation. Each morning, Dr. Parker continued his rounds, his presence a steady reminder of the person she had tried to diminish. Yet, with each encounter, she felt her hostility begin to wane, replaced by a sense of shame she could no longer ignore. She found herself watching him closely, noting the quiet confidence with which he approached his work, the way he treated every patient with the same unwavering respect. But her pride remained a formidable barrier, a silent force that held her back from fully acknowledging the wrong she had done. She wrestled with her emotions, caught between the person she had always believed herself to be and the person she feared she might become. One afternoon, as she lay in her room, lost in thought, Nurse Harris entered, her expression warm but weary. "How are you feeling today, Miss Wallace?" Nurse Harris asked, her voice gentle. Bethany hesitated, feeling a pang of guilt for the way she had treated the nurse in the days following her surgery. She managed a small, hesitant smile. "Better, I think," she replied, her voice quiet. Nurse Harris nodded, a note of surprise flickering in her eyes. "That's good to hear. Dr. Parker will be pleased to know you're making progress." Bethany's heart tightened at the mention of his name, the guilt settling heavy in her chest. She wanted to ask the nurse more about him, to understand the man who had faced her hostility with such grace. But the words caught in her throat, her pride refusing to let her admit her curiosity. Instead, she said softly, He's a good doctor, isn't he?" Nurse Harris smiled, her expression warm. "One of the best. He's dedicated, compassionate. He cares deeply about his patients." Bethany felt a pang of something she couldn't quite name. A sense of loss, perhaps, or regret. She had spent so long resenting him, trying to tear him down, yet here he was, a man who had offered her nothing but kindness. As the nurse left the room, Bethany lay back, her mind a tangled web of emotions she could no longer ignore. She felt as though she were standing on the edge of something profound, a truth she had spent her entire life avoiding. And for the first time, she allowed herself to consider the possibility that she could change, that she could confront the biases that had defined her life. But the journey ahead felt daunting, a path she wasn't sure she had the strength to walk. Yet as she lay in the quiet solitude of her hospital room, a single thought surfaced, a quiet but persistent whisper that refused to be silenced. She had been wrong. And the truth of that realization was both terrifying and liberating. The hospital's fluorescent lights buzzed quietly as Elijah finished his evening rounds. He had spent the day buried in a relentless rhythm of patient checkups, paperwork, and a consultation meeting with Dr. Holloway. Yet he couldn't shake the lingering presence of Bethany Wallace from his mind. Each time he entered her room, he braced himself for the venom she seemed so willing to hurl at him. But recently, something in her demeanor had shifted, so subtly it was almost imperceptible. On the surface, Bethany's words were still clipped, guarded by her habitual layer of disdain. But beneath that facade there was something else, a flicker of self-doubt, a hesitation that hadn't been there before. He wanted to dismiss it as wishful thinking, a product of his own exhaustion, but he had spent too many years learning to read people's faces, to mistake it now. He knew there was a storm brewing within her, a battle she wasn't quite ready to confront. As he left his final patient's room, Nurse Harris intercepted him, a quiet but perceptive smile gracing her face. "How's Ms. Wallace holding up?" she asked, handing him a chart. "She seems calmer these past few days. Hasn't requested a change of doctor since yesterday." Elijah raised an eyebrow, the surprise creeping into his expression. "That's progress, I suppose," he replied dryly, a note of skepticism threading his words. Nurse Harris chuckled softly, glancing down the hallway. "It's more than progress, Dr. Parker. For someone like her, it's practically a miracle." Elijah's lips quirked into a faint smile, though his mind remained guarded. He had learned the hard way not to place too much faith in sudden changes. People didn't just uproot lifelong prejudices overnight. And as much as he wanted to believe Bethany Wallace was capable of seeing past her biases, he knew it was a fragile hope, one that could easily be shattered. Still, he couldn't deny the curiosity simmering within him, a reluctant desire to understand what had prompted this shift. He knew all too well how resentment and anger could fester, consuming people from the inside out. And while he wasn't eager to extend Bethany any sympathy, he couldn't ignore the glimmers of humanity he glimpsed beneath her hostility. "Let's see how long it lasts," he said quietly, his voice tempered with caution. The following morning, Elijah entered Bethany's room, his expression neutral, his body language carefully guarded. He scanned her chart quickly, noting that her recovery was progressing well. Despite her complaints, the pain had lessened significantly, her vitals stable, her wounds healing as expected. And yet, she lay there, her hands twisted in the bedsheet, her gaze distant. "Good morning, Miss Wallace," he greeted her, his tone professional but distant. "How are you feeling today?" Bethany's gaze drifted to him, her expression unreadable. For a moment, she seemed on the verge of speaking, of saying something beyond her usual barrage of complaints. But the words remained tangled in her throat, her pride clinging to its last vestiges. "I'm feeling better," she replied, her voice soft, almost uncertain. She hesitated, her eyes flickering over him as if searching for something she couldn't quite grasp. Elijah observed her closely, his own emotions carefully concealed. He was used to patients like Bethany, people who looked at him and saw only the color of his skin, dismissing everything else. He had learned to keep his heart guarded, his kindness shielded by professionalism. But now, in this quiet, almost vulnerable moment, he felt the faintest hint of empathy slipping through his defenses. "That's good to hear," he replied, keeping his tone measured. "Your recovery is progressing well. You'll likely be discharged in a few days." A shadow flickered across Bethany's face, her expression tightening. "Discharged," she murmured, almost to herself. The word held a strange weight, as if it marked the end of something more profound than her hospital stay. She glanced at him, her gaze uncharacteristically open, as if daring herself to bridge the chasm between them. "Dr. Parker," she began, her voice unsteady. She looked away, her fingers twisting in the sheet. "I wanted to. Thank you. For your care, I mean. I know I haven't made it easy." Elijah's brow furrowed, the skepticism prickling at the edges of his mind. He wasn't sure if he could trust her words, if this was a fleeting moment of vulnerability or the beginning of something more genuine. But he nodded, offering her a quiet acknowledgement, his voice steady. You're welcome, Miss Wallace. It's my responsibility to provide you with the best care possible. Bethany's gaze remained fixed on the sheet, her hands fidgeting as if the act of gratitude had drained her. The silence between them grew thick, charged with an unspoken tension, a fragile connection neither of them was willing to acknowledge. But as Elijah turned to leave, her voice stopped him, a hesitant question lingering in the air. Dr. Parker, do you ever wonder if people like me can change? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The vulnerability in her tone surprised him, catching him off guard. He turned to face her, studying her carefully, his skepticism tempered by a reluctant glimmer of hope. I think anyone can change, Miss Wallace, he replied, his voice gentle but firm. But change takes more than words. It takes time, and it takes courage. You have to be willing to confront the truth about yourself, even the parts you don't like. Bethany's face flushed, the weight of his words settling over her like a shroud. She nodded, her gaze flickering to the window, her expression pensive. For the first time, she felt the full weight of her own shame, the undeniable truth that she had allowed her prejudice to dictate her actions. That evening, as Elijah sat in the quiet solitude of his office, his mind drifted back to his conversation with Bethany. He wanted to dismiss her words, to tell himself they were empty, that she would revert to her old ways the moment she left the hospital. But a small, stubborn part of him clung to the possibility that she was sincere, that beneath her bitterness and pride, there was a glimmer of humanity waiting to emerge. He had spent his entire life navigating a world that saw him as less, a world that forced him to work twice as hard for half the recognition. He had built walls around his heart, shielding himself from the barbed words and sneers that sought to diminish him. Yet, in that quiet moment with Bethany, he had felt something stir within him, a fragile hope that perhaps, just perhaps, people could change. But he couldn't afford to let his guard down. He knew the pain of betrayal, the sting of disappointment when people revealed their true colors. And as much as he wanted to believe in Bethany's transformation, he knew he had to protect himself, to remain vigilant. Dr. Holloway had once told him that he was too compassionate for his own good, a quality she admired but also worried would leave him vulnerable. He had always brushed off her concerns, confident in his ability to rise above the pettiness of others. But now, faced with the possibility that Bethany might genuinely regret her actions, he felt the uncertainty gnawing at him. With a sigh, he leaned back in his chair, staring up at the ceiling, his mind a tangled web of hope and caution. He knew that trust was a delicate thing, easily broken and difficult to repair. And as much as he wanted to believe in Bethany's change, he couldn't ignore the scars her words had left on his heart. Meanwhile, in the quiet darkness of her hospital room, Bethany lay awake, her mind a whirlwind of memories and regrets. She thought back to her childhood, to the way her parents had spoken about people like Dr. Parker, their voices laced with disdain, their words dripping with prejudice. She had never questioned them, had never thought to challenge the beliefs that had been instilled in her. And now, here she was, faced with the undeniable truth that she had allowed those beliefs to shape her life, to poison her interactions, to rob her of her humanity. She remembered her mother's voice, soft but unyielding, warning her to stay away from people who didn't belong, to keep her distance from those who didn't share her values. She had absorbed those words, had carried them with her like a shield, certain that they would protect her from a world she had been taught to fear. But now, lying in the sterile confines of the hospital room, she felt the weight of those words pressing down on her, suffocating her. She had been so certain of her superiority, so convinced of her own righteousness, that she had failed to see the humanity in others. And for the first time, she felt the full extent of her own blindness, the depth of the wounds she had inflicted on herself and those around her. Bethany closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek as she whispered into the darkness, a quiet confession meant for no one but herself. "I've been wrong. I've been so wrong." Bethany's days fell into a rhythm that was at once comforting and unnerving. The beeping monitors, the quiet footsteps of nurses, the soft voices of doctors, all of it formed a cocoon around her, a strange sanctuary where she felt both trapped and safe. But what haunted her most were the fragments of memories and realizations she could no longer suppress. At night, when the hospital grew quiet, these thoughts consumed her, pulling her deeper into an abyss of self-reflection. She hated the vulnerability that seemed to seep into her bones, the way it exposed parts of her that she had long hidden, even from herself. And yet, in that vulnerability, she felt something new, a tentative desire to understand, to make sense of the life she had lived and the beliefs she had clung to so tightly. She thought of her conversations with Dr. Parker, of the quiet strength in his eyes, the calm resilience in his voice. He had faced her disdain with unwavering professionalism, never stooping to her level, never allowing her bitterness to taint his duty. One morning, as Bethany lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, she made a decision. She would speak to Dr. Parker, honestly, this time. She would try, however difficult it was, to offer him something she had never before extended to anyone who didn't fit into her narrow worldview. Respect. When Dr. Parker entered her room for his morning rounds, Bethany felt a tremor of nerves tighten in her chest. She forced herself to meet his gaze, her throat dry, her palms clammy. "Dr. Parker," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. I need to talk to you." He looked up from her chart, his expression neutral but attentive. "Of course, Miss Wallace," he replied, his tone polite but reserved. Bethany swallowed, her mind racing with the words she had rehearsed, the apologies she had constructed and deconstructed in her mind countless times. But now, faced with the reality of the moment, the words seemed insufficient, hollow. "I've been difficult," she admitted, her voice faltering. She looked away, unable to bear the intensity of his gaze. "And I want to say that I'm sorry. I know it may not mean much, but—" She trailed off, her face flushed with embarrassment. For a moment, Elijah said nothing, his gaze steady, assessing. He was silent, as if weighing her words, as if searching for sincerity beneath the layers of pride and guilt. Finally, he spoke, his voice gentle but firm. "Thank you, Miss Wallace," he replied, a trace of warmth softening his tone. "It does mean something." Bethany felt a surge of relief, her heart lightening in a way she hadn't expected. She glanced up, meeting his gaze once more, and for the first time she felt a sense of connection, a fragile, tenuous bond formed not from shared experiences, but from a shared humanity. That evening, as Elijah sat alone in his office, he found himself replaying the conversation with Bethany in his mind. Her apology, though halting and tentative, had surprised him, catching him off guard in a way he hadn't anticipated. He had grown accustomed to patients like her, people who dismissed him at first glance, who saw only the color of his skin and nothing more. He had learned to navigate those encounters with professionalism, to protect himself from the sting of their prejudice by building walls around his heart. But Bethany's apology had breached those walls, if only slightly. He wanted to believe in her sincerity, to trust that her words were more than a momentary lapse in her usual disdain. But he knew the fragility of hope, the way it could crumble under the weight of disappointment. He had been here before, had allowed himself to trust only to be met with betrayal. He leaned back in his chair, staring up at the ceiling, his mind a tangle of emotions. He thought of his mother's words, the way she had always urged him to forgive, to extend compassion even to those who didn't deserve it. She had been a beacon of kindness in his life, a source of strength that had shaped him into the man he was today. And yet, even she had warned him of the dangers of misplaced trust. "Kindness isn't weakness, Eli," she would say, her voice soft but firm. But you must be wise in where you place it. Not everyone will appreciate it. As much as he wanted to believe that Bethany's apology marked the beginning of genuine change, he knew he couldn't let his guard down. He would continue to treat her with the same professionalism, the same compassion he extended to all his patients, but he would remain vigilant, cautious, ready to protect himself from the sting of disappointment if her words proved hollow. As the days passed, Bethany found herself grappling with an overwhelming sense of shame. Each time Dr. Parker entered her room, she felt the weight of her past actions pressing down on her. A relentless reminder of the person she had been. She wanted to distance herself from that person, to shed the layers of prejudice that had defined her. But it was a slow, painful process, one that forced her to confront truths she had long buried. She thought back to her upbringing, to the small, insular town where she had been raised, a place where conformity was prized and differences were met with suspicion. Her parents had been kind in their own way, but their kindness was limited, extended only to those who shared their beliefs, their values, their skin color. She had absorbed those values without question, had allowed them to shape her worldview without realizing the poison they contained. Now, lying in the sterile confines of her hospital room, she felt the full extent of that poison, the way it had seeped into her soul, staining her interactions, tainting her relationships. She had been so certain of her own superiority, so convinced of her own righteousness, that she had failed to see the humanity in others. But now, faced with the undeniable truth of her own blindness, she felt a desperate need to atone, to make amends for the harm she had caused. And yet, she didn't know where to begin. The shame was too deep, the weight too heavy, pressing down on her like a vice. One morning, as Bethany lay in her bed, watching the early light filter through the blinds, she made a decision. She would extend an olive branch, however small, to Dr. Parker. She didn't know if it would be enough to earn his forgiveness, but she had to try. She couldn't bear the thought of leaving the hospital without making some effort to bridge the chasm between them. When he entered her room later that day, she summoned the courage to speak, her voice trembling but determined. "Dr. Parker," she began, her gaze fixed on the blanket, her fingers nervously twisting the fabric. "I know I haven't given you any reason to trust me, but I want to change. I want to be better. I don't know how." Elijah paused, taken aback by her words. He had expected another apology, perhaps even a request for sympathy, but not this, a raw, unfiltered admission of vulnerability. He studied her closely, his skepticism tempered by a quiet sense of hope. "Change is difficult, Miss Wallace," he replied, his voice gentle but firm. "But it's possible. The first step is acknowledging the truth, facing the parts of yourself you don't like." Bethany nodded, her face pale, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I want to do that. I don't know where to start." Elijah hesitated, the cautious optimism in his heart growing stronger. He wanted to believe that she was sincere, that her desire for change was genuine. But he knew the path to redemption was long, and he couldn't guide her through it alone. "It's a journey, Miss Wallace," he said softly, his voice filled with quiet conviction, "and it's one you'll have to take on your own. But if you're willing to try, that's a good start." For the first time, Bethany felt a glimmer of hope, a faint but persistent light cutting through the darkness of her own guilt. She didn't know if she was strong enough to face the truth, to confront the person she had been, but she was willing to try, and for now, that was enough. As the days continued to pass, an unspoken understanding began to develop between Bethany and Elijah. Their interactions, once fraught with tension and hostility, had softened, taking on a quiet intimacy that neither of them could fully explain. Bethany no longer looked at him with disdain, and Elijah, though cautious, allowed himself to hope that her change of heart was real. One afternoon, as he checked her vitals, Bethany spoke, her voice hesitant but sincere. "Thank you, Dr. Parker," she said softly, her eyes meeting his. "For everything." Elijah nodded, his own expression softening, his voice steady. "You're welcome, Miss Wallace." In that moment, they shared a fragile but significant connection, a bond formed not from shared experiences, but from a mutual respect, a newfound recognition of each other's humanity. It was a small step, but for both of them, it was enough. The realization that her biases had run deeper than she'd ever admitted wasn't a relief for Bethany, it was a weight. She had accepted Elijah's treatment, allowed him to heal her, and now, as she found herself beginning to trust him, the magnitude of her past actions loomed larger. Each time he entered her room, her heart felt torn between gratitude and regret. Every polite gesture he extended, every calm reassurance, was a silent reminder of her wrongdoing. One morning, Bethany found herself alone, staring at her hands as though they held answers to questions she hadn't yet formed. She thought back to her family, to the lessons she had absorbed without question, to the fear and anger that had always simmered beneath the surface of her comfortable life. Her heart beat heavily in her chest as she recalled moments of disdain she'd directed at others, unaware of the damage such views had done to her soul and to others. Is this who I want to be remembered as? The thought struck her with the force of a revelation, filling her with a sense of urgency. She wanted to change, to heal the parts of herself that had festered with bitterness and prejudice for so long. But how? Later that day, as Elijah entered her room for his routine check, Bethany gathered her courage and spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "Dr. Parker, I know, I've caused a lot of trouble. I don't even know if it's fair to ask, but—" She hesitated, her gaze dropping. "Can you tell me what it's like? What it's been like for you?" Elijah paused, caught off guard by her question. Her eyes, usually cold and hardened, held a glimmer of sincerity, an openness he hadn't expected. He saw her struggle, the fragile hope that perhaps he might offer her some understanding. He took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully, aware that her inquiry was a tentative step toward genuine understanding. "It's hard to put into words, Miss Wallace," he began, his tone reflective. "People like you have often seen me as a symbol of something they don't want to understand. Growing up, it meant being dismissed, underestimated. As a doctor, it means I often have to work twice as hard to be seen as just competent. But it's also more than that. It's the constant weight of knowing that I'll always be fighting against assumptions." Bethany absorbed his words, the raw truth of them settling heavily in her chest. She wanted to speak, to offer some apology, but the words seemed inadequate, too small to encompass the depth of what he'd shared. Her eyes welled up with tears, and she looked down, embarrassed by the display of emotion. "I'm sorry," she whispered, "for everything." Elijah nodded, his expression thoughtful but guarded. "I appreciate that, Miss Wallace. But change takes more than words. It takes time and intention. It's a difficult journey." As Elijah left Bethany's room, her words lingered in his mind. He wanted to believe in her desire to change, to trust that her apology was more than just a fleeting sentiment. Yet a part of him remained wary, his years of experience with people like her urging caution, reminding him of the cost of misplaced trust. He made his way to the hospital's small outdoor terrace, a rare oasis of calm amid the hospital's bustle. As he leaned against the railing, he thought back to his own journey, to the moments when he, too, had wrestled with forgiveness and resilience. In medical school, he had faced discrimination, subtle at first, then increasingly overt as he moved through his training. The snide comments, the dismissive glances, the way certain professors seemed to hold him to a higher standard. It had all shaped him, hardened him. But he had persevered, determined to prove himself, not for their validation, but for his own sense of purpose. Now, faced with Bethany's apparent desire for redemption, he felt the weight of his own experiences pressing against him. A barrier he was reluctant to lower. He wanted to forgive her, to believe that she was capable of change. But forgiveness required vulnerability, and he wasn't sure he could afford that risk. Perhaps I'm holding her too much to my own expectations, he mused. Maybe it's about letting her prove herself, rather than expecting her to be perfect right away. With a sigh, Elijah made his way back inside, resolved to approach his interactions with Bethany with a tempered openness. He would extend her the benefit of the doubt, but he would not sacrifice his own well-being in the process. Over the following days, Bethany's behavior began to change in subtle but significant ways. She became more polite, her requests softer, her tone no longer laced with the same disdain that had once marked her every word. She even began to ask the nurses about their families, their lives beyond the sterile walls of the hospital. Slowly, she started to recognize the humanity in those she had once dismissed, her perspective shifting as she allowed herself to see beyond her own narrow experiences. One afternoon, as Elijah entered her room, she surprised him with a small but significant gesture. On the table beside her bed lay a book, one he had mentioned in passing during their last conversation, a memoir by a doctor who had written about his own experiences with prejudice and resilience. I thought, maybe I could read it, Bethany said, her voice hesitant, her gaze fixed on the book, to understand a little more about what you go through. Elijah looked at her, a spark of appreciation flickering in his eyes. The gesture was small, but it spoke volumes, a testament to her willingness to bridge the gap between them. He nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. I think that's a good start, he replied, his voice filled with quiet encouragement. It's a powerful story. As he checked her vitals, an unspoken understanding passed between them, a recognition of the effort they were both making to meet each other halfway. For the first time, Elijah felt a glimmer of hope, a cautious but genuine belief that perhaps Bethany's transformation was real. A week later, Bethany's daughter, Emily, arrived for a visit. Her daughter's arrival filled her with both relief and anxiety, as she was eager to reconnect but wary of the judgments she might face. Emily had always been more open-minded, challenging her mother's views with a quiet determination that Bethany had often dismissed. As Emily entered the room, her face softened with sympathy, but her eyes held a quiet strength that Bethany had always admired. "Mom," Emily said gently, taking her mother's hand. "How are you feeling?" Bethany smiled, though the expression was tinged with guilt. "I'm healing," she replied, her voice filled with a mix of relief and regret. "The doctor's here. They've been very good to me." Emily nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "I'm glad to hear that. I know it hasn't been easy for you, but I hope this experience has opened your eyes a little." Bethany's smile faltered, her chest tightening with shame. "It has," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "I've done said things I regret. But I'm trying, Emily. I want to be better." Emily squeezed her mother's hand, her own expression softened by understanding. "That's all anyone can ask for, Mom. Just keep trying. It's not about being perfect. It's about making the effort." Their conversation brought Bethany a sense of peace, a reassurance that she was on the right path. She knew the journey would be long, fraught with setbacks and moments of doubt, but for the first time, she felt a quiet conviction that she could change. Later that evening, Bethany found herself unable to sleep, her mind filled with thoughts of her conversation with Emily, of the progress she had made, and the work that still lay ahead. She pressed the call button, hoping to see Elijah. Though she wasn't entirely sure why, perhaps she wanted to share her experience, to let him know that his influence had made a difference. When he arrived, his expression curious, she gestured for him to sit beside her. "Dr. Parker," she began, her voice steady, "I had a visit from my daughter today. It made me realize I have a lot to make up for, not just with you, but with her, with everyone I've hurt over the years." Elijah listened, his expression softening as he took in her words. He could see the weight of her past bearing down on her, the regret etched into her features. He knew that the journey to forgiveness was a deeply personal one, but he wanted to offer her something to hold on to, a reminder that she wasn't alone in her struggle. "It's never easy to confront the parts of ourselves we'd rather ignore," he said gently. "But you're taking the first steps, and that's what matters. Change isn't about erasing the past. It's about building a better future." Bethany looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Dr. Parker, for everything. I don't know if I'll ever be able to repay you, but I'm going to try." Elijah nodded, a quiet sense of pride filling him. That's all anyone can ask for. Bethany's health continued to improve, but her mind often wandered back to the stark reality of her past. During the quiet hours of the evening, she would lie awake, grappling with the discomfort of remembering her own words and actions from years gone by. The people she had looked down upon, dismissed or scorned, had faces, lives, and stories, each one unique, each one worthy of dignity. One evening, Bethany found herself unable to sleep, her thoughts swirling with regret. She remembered a conversation with an old friend who had once made a derogatory remark about a coworker of another race. At the time, Bethany had laughed along, not realizing the impact such words carried. Now, the memory haunted her, filling her with a gnawing sense of shame. The guilt weighed heavily on her, like an invisible burden pressing down on her chest. It was exhausting, and she often found herself wondering if she was truly capable of change, or if these feelings were just temporary, fading once she left the hospital's protective cocoon. As she lay in bed, staring up at the darkened ceiling, a question burned in her mind. Can a person truly change, or are we forever trapped by our past? When Elijah entered her room the next day for his routine checkup, Bethany felt the urge to speak but hesitated, the words catching in her throat. She had shared her regrets with her daughter, but to share them with Elijah, the very person she had wronged, felt like a daunting step, one she wasn't sure she was ready to take. "Dr. Parker," she started, her voice barely above a whisper, Have you ever struggled with letting go of the past?" Elijah looked at her, his expression one of quiet contemplation. He understood the weight of her question, the vulnerability it took to even bring it up. For a moment, he considered his own struggles, the moments when memories of past injustices had clung to him, unwilling to let go. But he had learned, through years of resilience, that healing required courage and the willingness to confront pain, rather than bury it. "More times than I can count," he replied, his voice gentle but firm. "We all carry scars from our past, things we wish we'd done differently, but we can choose to grow from them. That's where true change begins." Bethany's eyes welled up and she quickly blinked the tears away, not wanting to break down in front of him. His words resonated deeply, sparking a glimmer of hope within her. If he could move forward, perhaps she could too. As the days passed, Elijah found himself reflecting on Bethany's question. He had been touched by her vulnerability, her willingness to confront the parts of herself that had once clung so fiercely to prejudice. He admired her determination, though a part of him remained cautious, wary of investing too much of himself in her journey. One evening, as he sat alone in the hospital's break room, his mind wandered back to his early days in medicine. He remembered a particular professor during his residency who had belittled him, questioning his abilities with a thinly veiled hostility. Those experiences had shaped him, teaching him resilience, but they had also left him guarded, his heart wrapped in protective layers. Yet, seeing Bethany struggle with her own demons stirred something within him, a reminder of his belief in people's capacity for growth. He wondered if his guardedness had at times prevented him from truly connecting with others, from offering the empathy he so often extended to his patients. Perhaps this was an opportunity, he mused, to soften some of those layers, to let himself see Bethany not just as a reminder of past hurts, but as a fellow human being striving to be better. One afternoon, as Elijah was reviewing patient charts, he saw a familiar face approach. Bethany's daughter, Emily. She looked at him with a warm smile, though her eyes held a hint of apprehension. "Dr. Parker," she greeted, extending a hand. "I just wanted to thank you for everything you've done for my mother. She's been through a lot." Elijah smiled, nodding. "I'm glad to see her improving. She's made remarkable progress both physically and, I believe, emotionally." Emily's smile faltered slightly as she looked away, her gaze contemplative. "I hope so. I know my mother has her flaws. I've spent my life trying to show her that the world is bigger than the narrow lens she's always viewed it through." Her voice softened, a hint of sadness creeping into her tone. "Sometimes I wonder if it's too late for her to change. She's so stubborn, so set in her ways. But since she's been here, she seems different, as if she's starting to see things in a new light." Elijah nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "Change is a difficult journey," he replied, "but I believe she's making an honest effort. It's not easy, confronting one's past, but the fact that she's willing to try speaks volumes." Emily looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "You're a patient man, Dr. Parker. Thank you for giving her a chance." They shared a quiet moment of understanding, both recognizing the fragility of Bethany's journey and the importance of the support surrounding her. Elijah felt a renewed sense of purpose, a reminder of the impact his work could have beyond the physical healing of his patients. Later that week, Bethany experienced a pivotal moment, one that would shape the course of her healing journey. She had been sitting by the window, watching the sunset cast a warm glow over the city, when a nurse entered the room to adjust her IV drip. The nurse was young, with warm brown eyes and a gentle smile. Her name tag read, Nadia. Bethany had seen Nadia before, but had never taken the time to speak with her beyond the customary greetings. This time, however, she felt a pull, a desire to know more about the people who had cared for her, who had treated her with kindness despite her past hostility. "Thank you, Nadia," Bethany said, surprising herself with the sincerity in her voice. Nadia looked at her, a hint of surprise in her expression. "You're welcome, Miss Wallace. Just doing my job." Bethany hesitated, then asked, "How long have you been working here?" "Almost 5 years now," Nadia replied, her voice warm with pride. "I love it here, helping people. It's a tough job, but it's rewarding." Bethany nodded, her gaze softening. "I never really understood how much work goes into caring for others. I always thought, I guess I never really thought about it." Nadia smiled gently, her eyes filled with understanding. "It's easy to overlook, I think. We don't expect recognition, just the chance to make a difference." As Nadia left the room, Bethany felt a swell of emotion, a realization that the people around her were not just faceless figures in a system, but individuals with lives, hopes, and dreams. It was a small but significant shift, one that deepened her commitment to the changes she was striving to make. That evening, as Elijah reviewed his notes, he found himself reflecting on Bethany's progress. He could see the change in her, the genuine effort she was making to bridge the gap between her past and her present. He felt a sense of pride, not only in her, but also in himself for having had the patience to guide her, to support her, even when she had pushed back with hostility and bitterness. He thought back to his conversation with Emily, her quiet hope that her mother could change. He realized that his role extended beyond medical treatment. He was part of a greater journey, a testament to the possibility of redemption, even in the most unexpected places. "Perhaps this is why I became a doctor," he mused, "to not only heal wounds but to foster understanding, to remind people of their capacity to grow." He resolved to continue offering Bethany his support, to be a steady presence in her journey towards self-awareness and change. He knew that her path would not be without setbacks, but he was prepared to stand by her, a reminder that compassion could sometimes be the strongest medicine. The days seemed to drift by as Bethany continued to recover. Yet, while her body was healing, her mind felt anything but calm. A torrent of emotions had begun to swirl within her: regret, anger, shame, and something new: hope. It was strange, she thought, how a place she had once viewed with dread had transformed into a space where she felt safe enough to wrestle with her deepest fears. Bethany found herself re-examining memories that had once been painted with certainty, but now appeared muddled, distorted by her own biases and assumptions. One memory surfaced more vividly than the others, of a time she had dismissed a family friend who had asked for help during a difficult period in his life. She had seen him as weak, incapable of taking responsibility for himself. Now, though, she wondered if her harsh judgment had been rooted in a desire to feel superior. What if I was wrong? She thought, a question that had echoed through her mind for days. What if my entire life has been shaped by my unwillingness to see others as they truly are? Elijah's voice, calm and steady, often came to mind during these reflections. His patience, even in the face of her cruelty, had struck her as profound. She realized that he had shown her a strength she had never known existed, a strength that was not about overpowering others, but about understanding and compassion. For Elijah, the past few weeks had been a delicate balancing act. His role as Bethany's doctor required him to remain objective, professional, and compassionate. Yet the closer they became, the more he felt the weight of her journey merging with his own. As he saw Bethany grapple with her past, he was reminded of his own struggles with acceptance, with facing a world that often judged him not by his qualifications but by his skin color. Elijah had worked tirelessly throughout his career to prove himself, to exceed the expectations placed on him by others. But watching Bethany's journey stirred a question in him, one that had lingered in the corners of his mind. How much of myself have I closed off in my pursuit of acceptance? He began to see that his guardedness, while a form of self-preservation, had also kept him from connecting deeply with others, particularly those he saw as carrying the same prejudices that had once hurt him. Perhaps, he thought, Bethany's willingness to confront her own biases could serve as a reminder to him that some people, even those with the most ingrained prejudices, could change if given the chance. One evening, Elijah sat alone in the break room, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. He realized that, in his own way, he was learning from Bethany's journey as much as she was learning from his compassion. He knew that their relationship was far from conventional, but perhaps that was what made it so significant. It was a challenge, an opportunity to bridge worlds that had long been divided by fear and misunderstanding. The next day, as Elijah made his way to Bethany's room, he felt a new sense of openness, a willingness to let their conversation stray beyond the medical realm. He knocked gently on the door, his presence met by Bethany's familiar but hesitant smile. "Good morning, Miss Wallace. How are you feeling today?" he asked, his tone warm but still professional. Bethany looked at him, her expression thoughtful. "I'm better," she replied, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "I don't mean just physically. I feel different. I can't quite explain it." Elijah pulled up a chair, sitting beside her. "Sometimes healing takes place in ways we don't expect. The body is only one part of it." Bethany hesitated, glancing down at her hands before speaking again. "Dr. Parker, I've done a lot of thinking lately about my past, the way I've treated people." She took a shaky breath, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of the blanket. "I've judged people harshly, especially those I thought were beneath me. And now, here I am, having been saved by the very people I once dismissed." Elijah listened in silence, sensing the weight of her confession. He could see the vulnerability in her gaze, the rawness of someone confronting her own flaws. "I used to think kindness was a weakness," Bethany continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought strength meant standing alone, never asking for help. But now, I see that I was wrong. I see that compassion is its own kind of strength, and maybe the most important kind. Elijah nodded, his expression softening. It takes courage to admit that, Miss Wallace. Change isn't easy. It requires us to face parts of ourselves we'd rather ignore, but it's never too late to grow. Bethany looked at him, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. I want to be better, Dr. Parker. I don't know if I can undo all the harm I've caused, but I want to try. Elijah reached out, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. You're already taking the first steps. The willingness to change is a powerful thing, and I'll be here to support you through it. Their conversation lingered in the air long after Elijah left her room, leaving both of them with a newfound sense of connection and purpose. For Bethany, it was a moment of clarity, a realization that she could no longer hide from her past. For Elijah, it was a reminder of the transformative power of empathy and understanding, and the hope that even the most entrenched prejudices could be overcome. Over the next few days, Bethany felt an overwhelming urge to reach out to the people she had wronged in the past. She wasn't sure where to start, but she knew that healing required more than just words. It required action. She thought back to a neighbor, Mrs. Ramirez, whom she had once ignored despite knowing that she was struggling financially. Bethany recalled how Mrs. Ramirez had always been kind, often offering her homegrown vegetables and a warm smile. And yet, Bethany had never reciprocated, her mind clouded by her own judgments. With her daughter Emily's help, Bethany drafted a letter, pouring her heart into each sentence. She apologized for her indifference, her failure to see the humanity in others. It was a small step, but one that symbolized her commitment to becoming a better person. As she placed the letter in an envelope, Bethany felt a strange mix of fear and relief. She was terrified of being rejected, of being unable to repair the damage she had done. But she also felt a glimmer of hope, a belief that perhaps, just perhaps, she could begin to make amends. During their next checkup, Bethany shared her small act of redemption with Elijah. She spoke of her desire to continue making amends, to confront the mistakes that had once defined her. Elijah listened, his heart swelling with a mixture of pride and humility. He had seen patients recover from physical wounds countless times, but witnessing Bethany's emotional transformation was something different, something he hadn't anticipated, but deeply valued. I'm proud of you, Miss Wallace, he said, his voice filled with warmth. Taking responsibility for our actions is one of the hardest things we can do, but it's also one of the most freeing. Bethany's smile was tentative but genuine. I owe you a great deal, Dr. Parker. Without your patience, your kindness, I don't think I would have come this far. Elijah shook his head, a gentle smile on his face. You did this, Bethany. I may have been there to help, but you were the one brave enough to face yourself. Their relationship, once strained and antagonistic, had evolved into something deeper, a partnership based on mutual respect and understanding. Elijah no longer saw Bethany as merely a patient. She was a testament to the possibility of change, a reminder that even those hardened by prejudice could find the strength to grow. Emily continued to visit her mother regularly, her admiration for Elijah growing with each encounter. She often stayed behind after visiting hours, chatting with him in the break room or sharing a quiet moment in the hallway. She saw the compassion he extended to her mother and felt a deep sense of gratitude, knowing that he had gone above and beyond his duty as a doctor. One evening, as they sat together, Emily expressed her appreciation. Dr. Parker, I know you've done more than just treat my mother's illness. You've shown her a kindness that I don't think she ever thought she deserved. Elijah smiled, his eyes reflecting a quiet humility. I believe everyone deserves kindness, Emily. Sometimes it's the people who need it the most who have the hardest time accepting it. Emily looked at him, her expression softening. Thank you for everything. You've given me my mother back in a way I didn't think was possible." They shared a moment of silence, each lost in their own thoughts. For Elijah, it was a reminder of the importance of his work, of the lives he touched beyond the confines of medicine. For Emily, it was a moment of profound respect, a recognition of the strength it took for someone like Elijah to continue extending compassion in a world that often met him with hostility. With her daughter's help, Bethany had managed to track down Mrs. Ramirez, her former neighbor. The process had been emotionally charged, filled with hesitation and self-doubt. The night before their meeting, Bethany barely slept, her mind racing with questions and insecurities. Would Mrs. Ramirez even remember her? Would she care? The following day, as they approached the familiar neighborhood, Bethany's heart pounded. It felt surreal to return to a place she had once taken for granted. Emily gave her mother's hand a reassuring squeeze, and they both took a deep breath before knocking on Mrs. Ramirez's door. A moment later, the door opened to reveal an elderly woman with silver-streaked hair and a warm, if cautious, smile. Bethany could see the years etched into her face, lines that spoke of both hardship and resilience. "Mrs. Ramirez," Bethany began, her voice wavering, It's Bethany Wallace. I used to live next door." Mrs. Ramirez squinted slightly, her expression shifting as recognition dawned. "Bethany," she said, her tone neutral but polite. "I remember you." The three women stood in silence for a moment, Bethany's mind racing to find the right words. Finally, she took a deep breath. "I know it's been years, and I understand if this feels strange, but I came to apologize for the way I treated you, the way I ignored you. I realize now that I never truly saw you, and for that, I am deeply sorry." A flicker of surprise crossed Mrs. Ramirez's face, and she studied Bethany closely, as if searching for sincerity in her words. After a pause, she nodded, gesturing for them to come inside. Inside the cozy living room, Mrs. Ramirez offered them tea and settled into her chair. Her gaze remained fixed on Bethany, calm but perceptive. "It takes courage to come back after all this time, to admit when you've been wrong." Bethany's shoulders relaxed slightly, encouraged by the woman's open response. "Thank you, Mrs. Ramirez. I was afraid you wouldn't even want to speak to me." Mrs. Ramirez gave a small, understanding smile. "We all make mistakes, Bethany, but it's never too late to make things right. The world has enough anger in it. Sometimes what we need most is forgiveness." Bethany felt a rush of gratitude, a warmth spreading through her chest. For the first time in years, she felt as though she could breathe without the weight of her past judgments pressing down on her. Emily observed the exchange in silence, her heart swelling with pride. She saw in her mother a vulnerability that she had long hoped to see, a willingness to grow and change. As they left, Bethany felt a sense of peace settling over her. It was a small step, but it was one she hadn't thought herself capable of taking. She glanced at her daughter, a soft smile on her face. "Thank you, Emily, for standing by me through this." Emily returned her smile, squeezing her hand. "I'm proud of you, Mom. More than you know." Elijah had heard about Bethany's meeting with Mrs. Ramirez during their next checkup, and he found himself deeply moved by her story. It was rare to witness someone confront their past so directly, to seek forgiveness without expecting anything in return. Yet, even as he supported her journey, he found himself grappling with his own doubts. He had spent years learning to forgive, to let go of the anger that had once consumed him. But there were days when the memories resurfaced, moments when he was reminded of the prejudice he had faced, even as a child. Despite his accomplishments, there were still times he felt like an outsider in his own field, an intruder in spaces where he was meant to belong. One evening, Elijah sat alone in his apartment, sifting through his memories. He thought back to his childhood, to the moments when his classmates had dismissed him, when teachers had questioned his abilities, subtly but unmistakably. The familiar sting of rejection tugged at his heart, and he wondered if, like Bethany, he too needed to find peace with his past. He knew that his success had been built on perseverance, on a relentless pursuit of excellence to prove his worth. But now he questioned whether he had truly found forgiveness, for others or for himself. The following day, Elijah found himself in Dr. Karen Holloway's office, a place he had come to appreciate as a refuge. Dr. Holloway had been his mentor, his guide through the most challenging periods of his career, and her calm presence always provided a sense of clarity. They sat in silence for a moment, Elijah's thoughts swirling. Finally, he looked up, his expression thoughtful. "Karen, have you ever struggled with letting go, with forgiving the people who've hurt you?" Dr. Holloway leaned back, a thoughtful expression on her face. "I think anyone who's ever worked in this field has had to grapple with forgiveness, Elijah. Medicine requires us to confront humanity in all its forms, its beauty and its ugliness. But holding on to resentment, it only harms us in the end." Elijah nodded slowly, her words resonating with him. "I know that. I've told myself the same thing for years. But sometimes I feel like the resentment has woven itself into my identity. That I've become so used to fighting that I don't know how to live any other way." Dr. Holloway gave him a compassionate smile. "Forgiveness isn't about forgetting what happened to us, Elijah. It's about freeing ourselves from the weight of it. If we carry that burden with us forever, it clouds everything we do. But when we let it go, we make room for compassion, for empathy, for growth." Her words lingered in his mind long after their conversation ended. He realized that forgiveness, like healing, was a journey. And perhaps just Bethany had started hers, he too needed to continue his own. During their next meeting, Elijah and Bethany found themselves discussing forgiveness, a topic that felt raw and personal for both of them. They had both seen the damage caused by anger and resentment, yet they had also experienced the freedom that came with letting go. "I used to think forgiveness was a sign of weakness," Bethany admitted, her gaze downcast. "I thought that if I forgave people, I was letting them off the hook. But now I see that forgiveness is about releasing myself from their hold over me." Elijah nodded, a faint smile on his face. "I used to think the same. But forgiveness, it's one of the strongest things we can do. It's an act of courage, of choosing to move forward, rather than being anchored in the past." Bethany looked at him, her expression thoughtful. "You know, Dr. Parker, I never expected to find a friend in you. I never expected that someone I once dismissed could become so important to me." Elijah's heart swelled at her words, and he felt a deep sense of gratitude. "Bethany, you've shown me something too. You've reminded me that people are capable of change, that even the most entrenched beliefs can shift with time and understanding." They sat in comfortable silence, their bond stronger than words could express. Both had come to realize that forgiveness wasn't a destination, but a journey, one they would continue to walk together. As Bethany's health continued to improve, she found herself contemplating how she could give back, how she could use her second chance to make a difference. She knew she could never erase the mistakes of her past, but she was determined to build a future filled with compassion and purpose. One day, she shared her thoughts with Emily, who listened with a mixture of surprise and admiration. "Mom, that sounds amazing. I think helping others would be a wonderful way to honor the journey you've been on." Bethany smiled, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. "I want to volunteer, maybe work with people who've been marginalized, people who've experienced the same kind of rejection I once inflicted on others. I want to show them that they're valued, that they matter." Emily hugged her mother tightly, her heart filled with pride. She had always hoped for this moment, a time when her mother's heart would open to the world in ways she had never thought possible. As Bethany's discharge date approached, Elijah reflected on the impact their journey together had had on him. He realized that his purpose as a doctor extended beyond treating physical ailments. It was about healing the whole person, about offering compassion and understanding, even to those who were hardest to love. Watching Bethany's transformation reminded him of the power of empathy, of the strength required to break down walls and extend a hand to those who had hurt him. He saw now that his role as a healer was not just about fixing what was broken, but about guiding people toward their own strength, their own redemption. On her final day at the hospital, Bethany expressed her gratitude to Elijah with tears in her eyes. "Thank you, Dr. Parker. You've given me more than just my health. You've given me hope, a second chance to be someone better." Elijah smiled, his heart full. "Bethany, you've done the hard work yourself. You've chosen to change, to open your heart. I'm just grateful I could walk this path with you." As they said their goodbyes, both felt a sense of closure, a recognition that their journey together had changed them both in ways they hadn't anticipated. They had confronted their fears, their insecurities, and their pain, and had emerged stronger, bound by a newfound respect for each other and a shared commitment to growth.